This is a sleep story about the English countryside. Not the version you glimpse from a motorway, or the one pressed into biscuit tins and calendars. The real one, the ancient, layered, complicated one, shaped over thousands of years by human hands, and yet still, somehow, very quiet. Tonight we're going to move through it slowly, from the Bronze Age farmers who first drew boundaries in the earth to the hedgerows they planted and are still standing today, from the medieval villages arranged around a church and a green to the poets who decided this landscape was worth grieving over, and to the ordinary people, not so very long ago, who had to fight for the right to roam in it, and for some of whom went to prison for doing exactly that. It's a long story, a quiet one, and it is still, in almost every sense, with us. Let's begin. The first thing to understand about the English countryside is that it's not natural. It looks natural, of course. The hedgerows, the meadows, the low hills worn smooth by centuries of weather. All of it has the appearance of something that grew of its own accord, slowly and without interference. But almost nothing in the English landscape is wild in that sense. Almost every field, every hedge, every pathway worn across a hillside is the result of deliberate human work. The countryside you are picturing right now, if you close your eyes, is an artefact. One of the largest and most extraordinary artefacts this country has ever produced. Evidence of agricultural organisation, field boundaries, pathways, burial mounds dates back to the Bronze Age, approximately 3,300 years before the Common Era. People were dividing the English earth, drawing lines through it, long before there was an England to even speak of. By the Iron Age, farmers were weaving hedgerows together with earthworks, ditches and banks, and in Cornwall, dry stone walls were rising to enclose fields. Not the tidy enclosures we associate with later centuries, something rougher, more gradual, more persistent. The Romans arrived in 43 AD and brought roads, towns, and an orderly mind, but the characteristic English landscape of long, narrow strips of cultivated land came later still, belonging to the Anglo-Saxon and medieval periods. By 1086, when William the Conqueror ordered a survey of everything in England worth taxing, the Domesday Book recorded a country whose agricultural landscape was organised almost entirely around communal farming on common land. The Domesday population of England fell somewhere between 1.7 and 2.5 million people, less by a very long way than the population of modern-day Manchester. And yet they had already been shaping this land for millennia, and the marks they left are still there if you know how to read them. There is a village in Nottinghamshire called Laxton that still farms on the medieval three-field rotation, and it is the last remaining working open field village in England. If you visit it today, you'd be looking at something most of England resembled nearly 1,000 years ago. The hedgerow, all of the things that make the English countryside English. The hedgerow might be one of the most quietly brilliant one that there is. Approximately 140,000 miles of public rights of way through England and Wales, and most of them run alongside hedges. Approximately there are 140,000 miles of public rights of way through England and Wales, and most of them run alongside hedges. The hedgerow is the wall of English countryside, its living boundary, its oldest archive, and some of them predate the parish churches beside which they grow. In Devon, over a quarter of hedges are believed to be more than 800 years old. Judith's Hedge in Cambridgeshire, the oldest known surviving hedgerow represents approximately 100 years. A hedge with one species is likely under a century old. A hedge with 10 or 12 species has probably been standing for 1,000 years. You can read a hedgerow by the way you might count rings of a tree. The landscape historian Oliver Rackham, whose definitive work, The History of the Countryside, transformed our understanding of this ancient ecology. He often used Hooper's rule to demonstrate how hedgerow functions as living libraries of biodiversity and historical continuity. The hedgerows planted during the enclosure acts of the 18th and 19th centuries run in very straight lines, visible clearly across the Midlands, ruler-straight divisions drawn by parliamentary decree. Ancient hedgerows follow winding, irregular lines, often tracing older parish boundaries or forgotten trackways. Straight means new in the language of hedges, curve means old. Hawthorn is the most common hedgerow tree and has been trimmed and layered in England since the Romans were here. The elder produces flowers in the summer and berries in autumn. The wild service tree, not a species people could name, is a reliable indicator of an ancient hedgerow, found only where the continuity of the landscape has never once been broken. 2/3 of England has been continuously hedged for over 1,000 years. The English village. The English village, as most people imagine it, a cluster of houses around a green, a church at one end, a pub at the other, lanes leading out into fields, has its roots in the Anglo-Saxon period, though it took centuries of accumulation to become what it is now. The earliest Anglo-Saxon settlements were small and built of wood, set on light fertile soils near fresh water and woodland. Weststow in Suffolk, which has been occupied from approximately 420 to 650 AD, is the best preserved Anglo-Saxon village in England. It's not grand, a few timber buildings in a river valley, but it is the starting point of something that would eventually become 10,000 England villages. By the middle of the Anglo-Saxon period, villages were taking shape. Settlements gathered around a central point, with the open fields extending beyond, and at the centre, almost always, a church. The Christianisation of England began with Augustine's mission in 597 AD. Pagan temples were converted, wooden churches spread across the country, and in time the stone church became the most permanent structure in any village, older than any other building. The one thing that almost every generation had in common. Greenstead Church in Essex holds the distinction of being the oldest wooden church in the world. Its nave timbers dating from around 1060, with traces of earlier wooden structures on the same site going back to the 6th or 7th centuries. It is small and dark, surrounded by old yew trees. It has been there in one form or another for approximately 500 years. The village green was traditionally used as common grazing land, as a residual piece of the old commons, as well as for markets and communal gathering. Many survive in their original form. Many others have been built around it, reduced or quietly absorbed in the surrounding streets. But the pattern remains: the church, the green, and the lanes leading out. The village is still, in its Most farms were more productive, and the agricultural revolution that fed England's rapidly growing industrial cities depended on it. For the rural poor, it was devastating. A poet witnessed it directly. John Clare was born in 1793 in Helpston, Northamptonshire, the son of a farm labourer, and he watched enclosure arrive in his village as a young man, spending the rest of his life writing about what it felt like to lose a landscape known since our childhood. He is widely regarded as one of the most important nature poets in the English language. In his poem, The Moors, it mourns the open fields where he roamed as a boy, grieving their disappearance with a precision that time has not softened. He died in 1864 in a lunatic asylum where he had spent the last 23 years of his life. The landscape enclosure created is the landscape most of us would now call traditional English countryside. The English countryside is not only a physical place though, it's also a cultural idea, one that was partly invented or at least carefully constructed by a handful of painters and poets in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and the version of it you carry in your mind has been shaped more than you might expect by two men in particular. William Wordsworth was born in 1770 in Cockermouth in Cumbria, in the heart of what we now call the Lake District, and he spent most of his adult life there, first at Dove Cottage in Grasmere, and later at Rydal Mount, where he remained until his death in 1850. In 1798, together with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he co-authored Lyrical Ballads, a collection widely regarded as the founding work of English Romantic poetry and one of the most significant books in the language. His Guide Through the District of the Lakes, published in 1820, helped spark the first wave of mass tourism to the region, and he was, in the most direct sense, the person who taught England to love its own landscape. Wordsworth was also, in an early and in very important way, a conservationist. Already concerned about the effects of increased human activity on the Lake District in the early 19th century, he argued, unusually for his time, that the countryside had a moral claim on all people, not only those who owned it. That argument eventually became the intellectual foundation for the National Parks movement, and later the work of the National Trust, founded in 1895 to preserve places of historical interest and natural beauty for the nation. John Constable was born in 1776 in Suffolk, the son of a mill owner. His most famous painting, The Hay Wain, was exhibited in 1821, showing a hay wain crossing a shallow ford on the River Stour on a summer's day, and the sky full of what Constable called the chief organ of sentiment in a landscape painting. The Hay Wain failed to find an English buyer when it was first exhibited. It was French collectors and critics who initially championed his work, and he was not elected a full member of the Royal Academy until 1829 at the age of 54. He was more celebrated in France than in his own country during his lifetime. Even so, the image he made of the Suffolk countryside entered the national imagination so completely that the area around the river is still called Constable Country. Historians have suggested that part of the Hay Wain's eventual power lay in its timing, offering wealthier viewers an image of a countryside that was, even then, beginning to disappear. The Victorian Albert Museum holds the largest collection of his work, much of it donated by his daughter. For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the right to walk in the English countryside, particularly on moorland and upland, was not something ordinary people possessed. The land was privately owned, the grouse moors were kept for shooting, the fells and the open hillsides were, in law, Derbyshire at 636 metres as an act of deliberate, organised trespass. Leading them was Benny Rothman, a 20-year-old mechanic from Manchester. Kinderscow was kept as a grouse moor, actively managed for perhaps 12 days a year. The rest of the time it stood empty and walkers were refused access. 6 men were arrested, 5 were convicted and imprisoned, and their sentences caused public outrage, with sympathy for the access movement growing dramatically in the months that followed. A rally at Winners Pass in the Peak District shortly after drew 10,000 people. On the 16th of December 1949, the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act received royal assent with all party support. The Peak District was designated England's first national park on the 17th of April 1951, the Lake District following the same year. The right to roam freely on open land was finally enshrined in statute with the Countryside and Rights Act of 2000, 68 years after the Kinderscow trespass. That act now covers roughly 6,700 square miles of open country and registered common land in England and Wales. England's 10 national parks now receive more than 100 million visitors per year, with the Peak District alone drawing over 13 million. Benny Rothman spent 3 months in prison for walking up a hill. I'd like to leave you now, if I may, with a small, imagined scene. It's an autumn afternoon somewhere in the Yorkshire Dales, the time of year when the bracken has turned from green to that particular shade of amber that seems to almost generate its own light. The sky is high and pale, there is no wind to speak of. A footpath runs alongside the top of the ridge, dry stone walls on either side that are running away over the hill in both directions until they disappear. The stones are limestone pale grey, fitted together without mortar, by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. These particular walls were built in the early 19th century during the enclosure of the Dales. The men who built them moved from parish to parish, following the work. The wall on the left of you stands perhaps 3 feet tall, slightly bowed in the middle where the stone has been displaced and not yet replaced. Moss has grown along the top stones, and lichen has made the whole surface look much older than it is, though it is old at 200 years. If you were to count the species in the hedgerow at the bottom of that field, the hawthorn, the blackthorn, the elder, the hazel, the field maple, you might be looking at something like 500 years old. Somewhere, as you look out, below, in the valley, there's a village. A stone church whose Norman foundations date from the 12th century, built over an earlier Anglo-Saxon site. A green, a lane, a pub with a fire. Because it's October and somebody has lit it early, the light from the window is just the warmest thing visible from this hillside. The countryside has been here for a very long time. It has been farmed, enclosed, grieved over, painted, fought for, and walked. It has been a living thing and a cultural idea at the same time. It is quieter now than it was. It's more fragile than it looks, but the walls are still standing. The footpath is still here, still legal, still yours to walk on, and the valley below, the church has been there since before anyone now living was born, and will almost certainly still be there when all of us are gone. That is, I think, what the English countryside is: patient, layered, and very old. And tonight it's entirely at peace. That is all for tonight. I hope it was enough to carry you somewhere green and quiet. If you're still awake, that's perfectly alright. Simply let your eyes stay closed. Let your breathing slow naturally, and let everything else settle.